Buon pomeriggio.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome our guests, but before thanking them personally, I'd like to thank the European Parliament, the services and the team from the European Parliament who made this debate possible, which is taking place in a hybrid, and I'd like to thank the interpreters who will help us to speak to closer to our citizens, make them feel closer to the European Parliament and to us. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank Admiral Dario Giacomin, who's the military representative at the EU Military Committee, Professor Antonello Provenzale, Director of the Geoscience and Georesources Institute from the National Research Centre, Giovanni Romani, Head of the Middle East, North African Sahel section within the DG Political Affairs and Safety Policy of NATO, with Alice Ambos, who is a consultant for NATO politics. Analysts from the Inthe Group, Michele Pavan, Matteo Frigoli, Saverio Lesti, Caitlin Elizabeth Rabe, Andrea Marco Silvestri, for their work. We also have Lorenzo Pinelli, who's a counsellor for African questions and delegated to the Africa Group from the Italian representation of the EU. And good afternoon to you, Councillor Pinelli, and a thanks to Ambassador, the Political Committee of Safety of the European Union, Marco Peronacci, for having allowed us to have you here present with us today. Today's discussion, entitled The Geostrategic Dynamics of North Africa and Sahel, European Strategy, shows the complexity of the region, its diversity, its power and its influence. Together with the nations and the people of Africa, we are still trying to deal with the problem of the lack of safety, of security in the African continent, which is the opposite of stability, development, and that is at the basis of our cooperation commitments. This is taking place on the day when France is declaring the official ending of the anti-jihadist operation in Sahel, reducing the visibility of the French military in Africa, and in the day in which the strategic safety and security national program for France. I'm saying also what was stated by General Claudio Graziani on the south of Europe when he was president of the Military Committee of the EU. In other words, from Libya to Sahel, the general scenario of this crisis can be viewed in what I would consider a triangular relation between instability, uncontrolled migration, and terrorism. However, we also have to consider even a wider humanitarian tragedy, the food crisis which is ongoing in Africa, where more people who died during the pandemic could die, more people than have died during the war. Food insecurity and hunger in the world is scary. In Afghanistan, there are 20,000 victims. In Yemen, 19 million. Sahel, 18 million. And in the Horn of Africa, 37 million. We are just seeing the first signs of the disaster which we will be facing. So we have to set up emergency food assistance, recognizing that climate change will be with us forever. These shocks will become worse, and for those communities or populations who depend from livestock, from feed and from water, we have to show that there can be alternatives, as we've done the same with vaccines. Today's discussion originates from a study carried forth by young analysts from the Italian association Mondo Internazionale, Minter Group, who will show their main results and recommendations for future actions of the EU in North Africa and in Sahel, a long arc of instability which includes Sahel and the Horn of Africa. I'd like to warmly welcome you all here in the home of European people. Welcome to the European Parliament. The Parliament thanks you. You have 5 minutes each, and I'd like to ask you to respect this timing. And with great pleasure, I now give you the floor, Mr. Pavan. Thank you all, and thank you for this invitation and for your hospitality. I will take less than 5 minutes and I'll give the floor to my colleagues so we can look further in depth on the various studies that have been carried out by this. We decided to show the title in this way, thanks to a mechanism which is self-perpetuating between Sahel and North Africa. And I think we could consider this as a reference in a wider context. Our approach, if you look at the index, you can see here it's an interdisciplinary approach. And when just looking at the question of socioeconomic security, we decided to correlate the data to see the situation, the geopolitical system. North Africa is certainly has an impact on the stability in the EU, and not only on its external borders, but inside too, due to immigration and further impact which can take place in the context. But it's also an area of transit which shows what is happening on the margins, basically Sahel and the Horn of Africa. Sahel is the object of the second slide. We have the same data here to cross-correlate them and compare them to the data in the first phase to be able to give a more comprehensive view of the proposals and the initiatives which the EU can carry forth, in addition to what is already ongoing. I'd like to quote briefly the points which emerged from this analysis. Basically, cross-correlation between security and the economy. This is not just the beginning of a crisis, but can certainly be important. What is important here is the communication of society, so it's yet a further aspect. It's not just economic questions, but the important thing is to look at the environment and climate. This is one of the cases which will be quoted in Sahel, will be Nagat, but it's not the only case which has to be analyzed within the framework, this framework. The important thing here that was also stressed by other analysts is the interaction between climate change and the impact it has on the stability and the security of these areas. I would like to conclude by giving the floor to Matteo Fregoli, who will start from the aspects of North Africa. Thank you all. I'd like to thank Matteo Frigoli. I'm an analyst for safety and I'll talk about the elements of instability in North Africa and the possible strategies of the EU in this sense. The countries taken into consideration are the coastal countries of North Africa, Libya, Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia. I will go by points to end up talking about EU strategies. An important point as to the instability of these areas is due to the fact that all these areas have one element of territories that are not governed. So there's a void where the institutions can't control their territory. And that's fertile both for the creation and the extension of the the influence of transnational terrorist organizations. Now, if we add to this, there's also that of porous borders that are built up on the first element, so territories that are not governable or not governed with porous borders are easier prey for transnational terrorist systems who also have a lot of weapons available. Now, if we look at the countries that have been checked here, and we look from the top, we see that geographically Libya is rather central. Libya has the most complex security situation, and its problems expand to the others. So we have territories that are not governed with porous borders, terrorist organizations that are transnational, that are contained by the states, with measures, though with national measures, so inadequate. Another element, which is not so much for military defense against this type of organization, which could be Al-Qaeda in Maghreb or Prague and the Islamic State, is more a question of human safety, because these countries are states that of origin and of transit for human trafficking, where the enemy, within inverted contexts, these terrorist organizations, is more difficult to distinguish, to identify, because in a non-governed territory it becomes a sub-regional political entity. And these are states where there is a reason for all this trigger, which is poverty and the absence of any form of welfare for the most disadvantaged sizes of the population. Now, all the states we have taken into consideration are engaged in military operation, counterinsurgency or counterterrorism. There's a cooperation between Tunisia and Algeria in this sense, but all these states have got pressure from non-state organizations, which are a phenomenon which regards the whole area. One possible strategy for the EU in this sense could be a layered strategy, a pyramid, where the first step is defense. In other words, give instruments for support and assistance to these states to guarantee the defense of the institutions. And this tool is never enough alone. And here we're looking from the point of view of safety and security from the socio-political point of view, because if you add to this only a military type of defense, you also have to guarantee capacity, so capacity building for these states, and offer at least tools for survival to the more disadvantaged parts, and guaranteeing instruments in capacity building to adapt their welfare for to the most disadvantaged parts of the population. Usually they are young and fertile terrain for recruitment of these organizations. And this is an element which covers all these states that cannot alone contain elements who go beyond their borders. So a strategy based on 3 points. 1, military defense, and 2, which have to do with security in general. Strategy, a concrete strategy, because these are points that we can deal with in the short term. So it is something really factual. It's not something that you have to seek technologies which don't exist. I've finished, so I give the floor to Kevin Reid.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Member of European Parliament, Anna Bonfrisco, for commissioning this analysis. And I'm Caitlin Rabe. I am the political and economic consultant and analyst at Mondo Internazionale in Minter Group. And I'm going to be taking Matteo's overview of the sociopolitical aspects of the countries of North Africa and move it into an economic and environmental analysis. So as you can see here, the North of Africa represents a huge priority for the EU from an economic perspective, because the EU is the largest trade partner for each of the 4 countries being analyzed. To begin to analyze the economic state of the 4 countries under analysis in North Africa, I'd like to begin with an overview of the unemployment rates, which tend to be rather high in all 4 of the countries, especially in Libya. This is especially pertinent when we discuss the youth population, because youth population is severely underemployed in Arab countries in general. And it has been observed that there is a correlation between youth unemployment and large levels of disenfranchisement and socio-political instability in any given country. So that's a current issue, and it will continue to be a current issue in the future in the 4 countries. Coming here, we can also see that the trend from 2000 to 2020 shows us that there has been a growing over-reliance on the service sector and a reduced agricultural sector in the north of Africa for factors that we will see in a moment. And why this is relevant is the fact that the service sector, went too far. The service sector is actually the sector that is most likely to generate precarious jobs. And the fact that there is a growing precariousness within the service sector and an over-reliance on the informal sector in the north of Africa has created a sort of vicious cycle of high levels of unemployment, over-reliance on very precarious sectors, and thus further disenfranchisement, especially on the part of the youth populations. This is also related to the idea of the illicit sectors, as the inability to find or maintain a job plus disenfranchisement will push people to participate in the phenomenon of especially illegal trafficking routes. For example, we have maps here of known trafficking routes in human trafficking, drug trafficking, and weapon trafficking throughout the North Africa and the Sahel. Beyond this general backdrop of the economy of North Africa, which really started to be exacerbated following the Arab Spring, there's also the phenomenon of the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the North of Africa. First of all, foreign direct investments were reduced mainly in Egypt and in Tunisia as a result of the relatively higher number of people that arrive in those countries from other countries. However, we can see the greatest levels of sociopolitical instability in highly oil-dependent countries due to the fact that the decrease in demand for crude oil as of 2020 led to oil-dependent countries such as Libya, as you can see on this graph here, to struggle to break even with the Brent crude oil price in 2020. And moving directly into the environmental aspects, so some of which are highly related to and correlated with some of those economic aspects I just described, I'd first like to start on the subject of water, because of course, when we're talking about the north of Africa and the Middle East, we're talking about a naturally desert environment. But when beyond the natural environment of the area, we have also witnessed a growing frequency of drought in the area, especially in areas with largely mismanaged water supplies. Ironically, and at the same time, however, the reduced rainfall has also meant that rainfall has become more torrential when it does arrive, meaning that there is also a tendency for more flooding along major coastways, such as along the Mediterranean coast and along the Blue Nile in Egypt. Moving forward here, the concept of water is, of course, also relevant to the idea of agricultural production. As agriculture and as rainfall become less reliable sources of employment, subsistence, and income, especially for rural peoples, these agriculture producers and rural peoples are going to be pushed away from the agricultural sector and away from the rural areas, leading then into that same vicious cycle of lower levels of agricultural production. And this is going to create a problem for the nations at large, as they are already some of the most import-dependent countries in the world in terms of food security. There is, however, what I would call a silver lining, that we're also talking about the area of the world with the largest rates, with the highest levels of sunshine. Algeria especially has a huge potential for solar power energy, and it actually has the ability to become not only self-sufficient based solely on solar power, but it also has the ability to become the EU's main provider of electricity just with solar power. And so based on the points that Matteo and I discussed, I would give two proposals for EU-North Africa relations, the first of which is to create a greater focus on multilateral and regional cooperation in order to counter and in order to enforce regional cooperation amongst the countries, especially on cross-border issues, such as Mediterranean coastal flooding, which is not only relevant to all four of the North African countries, but also to the countries along the southern border of the European Union. also solar power installations that may cross the borders, and migration, trafficking, and trade issues. So I would also propose a greater focus on cultural diplomacy and education initiatives, as the disenfranchisement that we discussed, along with online disinformation, is more likely to lead to radicalization and further sociopolitical instability. And with that, I'll close, and I will pass the mic on to Saverio Lesti.
Buonasera.
Good afternoon. I'd like to address my thanks to Madam Bonfrisco for making this possible. Thank you to our hosts in the EP, and thank you to the technical team for making this possible. I'm Saverio Lesti. I'm a security and defence analyst, and I will be turning my attention to security, defence and economic aspects of the Sahel. The Sahel has a very precarious internal situation. We see extremely weak political structures. We have a lot of poverty, particularly rural poverty. We have jihadist groups, we have organised crime, we have terrorist groups who all make a very dangerous mix in this area. In addition, there are struggles to control scarce water resources, which is vital for agriculture. And we also see clashes between organised crime and local government, and we're seeing as well increasing geopolitical competition in this area. Russia, for example, is becoming increasingly involved. Poverty is a critical factor, both for regional development, but also for the risk of destabilisation in the whole sub-Saharan region. When it comes to the main threats in the region, there are three Islamist terrorist groups: the ISGS, the JNIM, and ISWAP. ISGS is linked to Islamic State, and these groups are active in northeastern Nigeria, in the Lake Chad Basin, but they're active in the whole region, from Mali to Chad, but also, as I said, in Nigeria. And the borders between Mali, Chad, and Burkina Faso are also areas where we're seeing very high levels of military, paramilitary activities. Recently, we've also seen local organised crime on the up, which is used to support terrorist groups to finance their activities, particularly trafficking in human beings, arms trafficking, but also bribes for the safety of local transport. And we're seeing this spreading to the Nigerian coast, which is an area where a lot of trade routes operate. The most important levels of illegal trafficking have to do with human trafficking, where we have routes from North Africa to Europe, and that's an important source of resources for terrorist groups. Then arms trafficking by terrorists and by other local armed groups as well. And then we have drugs trafficking, cannabis, cocaine, and heroin as well. Again, this is a source of income for locals and also for terrorist groups. Russian influence is on the increase in Africa in general, but in the Sahel. And this is proven by what's happened recently with the coup d'etat in Mali and Burkina Faso. And they're acting on the economic level, access to natural resources, agricultural products, fertilizers, weapons, and advanced technologies such as satellites. Then they have a military presence too, particularly when it comes to using the Wagner group to do that. And then diplomatically too, they receive support within the UN that support the diplomatic positions adopted by Moscow. And again, this was quite clear very recently at the UN General Assembly when it came to Ukraine. Agricultural economics accounts for 66% of total employment in this region, and 78% of agricultural workers are employed at regional level. And then, of course, you've got ancillary sectors, food processing, food marketing, and almost 31% of employment in the area is in the ancillary agricultural sectors. Then energy and mineral resources. Africa is becoming a very important source of alternative energy supplies to Russia, Nigeria and Algeria in particular, but then there are reserves of minerals in the area, particularly Nigeria, for example, is actually the fourth largest producer of minerals that are required for nuclear plants. Critical issues. The sub-Saharan Africa and Sahel is actually an area where 19% of young people are neither in education, employment or training, and COVID led to losses of approximately 200 billion from the African economy in 2020. And all of this has meant it's difficult to implement economic reforms, which are vital. And a critical aspect is the lack of access to energy infrastructure. Locally, electricity networks are almost non-existent. For the European Union, it's important that it maximises what it's already doing, that it optimises that, and that we actually have a regional initiative which will harness all of the resources to ensure that a critical mass is achieved, to have more of an impact at regional level as well as in the individual states. We need to set up strategies against piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. Again, EU needs to be a permanent presence there. Cultural diplomacy is vital to counter Russian influence, for example, amongst the ruling class, to stop them from seeing Europe as a former colonial power and as a genuine partner. And at a military level, we need to also ensure that the interventions of individual member states are harmonised and lead to processes of greater cooperation between the member states. We don't want things to be fragmented with just France showing a presence. My colleague, Andrea Marco Silvestri, has the floor. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'll conclude our presentation by commenting on some points that are linked to the anthropological, ethnic and social picture. The ethno-sociological picture in the Sahel in Northern Africa, it's very important to have an integrated, holistic view in order to be able to more easily understand local culture, languages, cultures, history, and how those lead to the problems we're seeing today in a very complex region. Even today, ethnic belonging is very important. That's often underestimated at a local and regional level. Social inequalities are highly correlated to ethnic group, and the same comes to employment. That's the case too. And so what we're also seeing is that exports are focused on non-processed minerals. And again, these tend to come from the Northern African countries, go to European countries to be processed, which means that the money flows out. Religion, the differences between the different religions also have to be fully analysed and taken into account. Over the last 100 years, we have seen changes in the dominant religion, and unfortunately what this has meant has been we have seen discrimination and violence towards some components of the category. You also have to take into account desertification and water. This is a critical factor, particularly when it comes to food security in the region. We've already mentioned the problems with desertification. This is updated information, but we are seeing water basins that have got 63% less water than they did have. So that's really worrying. Food security, that's often mentioned. And again, there are 4 pillars to take into account: access to food, the availability of food, the use of food, and ensuring that safe food is provided at all times. And we also have to look at the role of pastoralism and agriculture, because again, what ethnic group one belongs to will have an effect on where one is employed, for example, in the rural economy. In the future, we need to be working on green walls initiatives where we enhance support for local communities. We also need to work on developing empowerment and ownership, and we need to better target the areas where we intervene more than we have in the past. Thank you for your attention, and that's all I wanted to say.
No.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that became increasingly interesting as each report built on the earlier ones. And I think it shows the quality of our speakers. I'd like to express my thanks on behalf of the EP for having provided us with this information. This will be of use to us as political decision makers, but it will also be very much of use to all the technical staff, the experts that work in this field, the link between climate change and poverty is one of the largest challenges facing humanity, and you've analysed the factors contributing to this. We have fragile states where communities are starting to compete for natural resources, but where we also see insurgencies, and we're seeing unrest, Somalia, for example, Algeria, and even that being extended to become terrorism, which again means that the peoples living there are living very unsafe lives. But maybe the digital and green revolutions will mean that we can actually now make up for some gaps that exist and harness science to improve the situation so that there's a lesser gap between Europe and Africa, between the European Union and Africa, than is the case at the moment. Then scientific diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, they are an important part of what needs to be done, along with trade, which you also mentioned. And then again, technological developments might help us to ensure that all of us understand that Africa too can contribute much more than we might imagine today as we move forward with the digital transition. And for Africa too, digitalization can be enabling. Now, in Mozambique and Nigeria, we've seen US satellites being deployed for internet access, but EU Copernicus Earth observation satellites monitor the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, Northern Africa, and in Italy, we're helping to build up capacity in Kenya, and obviously that in Italy reminds us of areas where we have high capability levels. And then there's Nigeria and also Ethiopia, where we've got work going on. We've also got colleagues who are collaborating with colleagues in Israel on problems on the water cycle, and with the Chima Foundation as working on risk analysis. So I'd like to pass the floor now to Professor Antonello Provenzale to go into more details on this. Thank you. I apologise for not being there in person. Could we see the slides, please? Thank you very much. Let's move immediately to the second slide, please. Next slide, please. Problems arise as a result of the increase of greenhouse gases, which have led to an increase of temperatures of around 1.4 degrees centigrade over land in 100 years, leading to higher evapotranspiration, higher levels of energy in the atmosphere, i.e. stronger winds, and changes in the distribution of precipitation. What you're seeing here is a map of winter rainfall changes in two areas of the world particularly affected, one northwest of North America and the other the Mediterranean basin and the sub-Saharan area. So these areas have been particularly affected by the fall in precipitation levels. Next slide, please. Less precipitation leads to more evaporation, which means a higher probability of droughts. As you can see here, the graph that you can see, the colours, these are estimates of the impact of drought on agriculture in August 2021, so extremely significant. This has an impact on food security, on hygiene, sanitation, access to resources, and we have just looked at this equally across the population, but actually it affects women and children more. So this is an environmental factor that aggravates current geopolitical tensions, both at a local and international level. A further factor for complication. Next slide, please. So the challenges to be addressed are firstly to design water management programs where there are scarce resources and high interannual variability. Then we need to develop risk reduction strategies for intense localized precipitation events and sudden flood events and wildfires, which we're seeing in North Africa. We also need to study the social, environmental and geopolitical results of climate-induced stresses and the impact, for example, of human displacement. The first point, I mentioned the River Jordan, which not on its own, but is the subject of a lot of study that's being conducted by Jordan and Israel because it's a common water resource, or aquifer recharge. That's an important point too. Next slide, please. Irrigation in Morocco. And here I'm quoting a project from the Polish Scientific Institute together with the Moroccan University on the use of satellites to identify the best irrigation strategies for the area. So looking at the problem and then moving to a solution, optimal use of water. Next slide, please. And here we have an Italian project from the Chima Foundation, which has been working on a series of studies on multi-hazard risk profiles in many African countries. Next slide, please. Here we have the example of flooding with estimated damage for now and for future decades, and how these can be used to prop up food security, social development, and to reduce inequalities and the impact of these events. Next slide, please. And then recent applications of the risk profiles you can see here, They've been used to calculate better ways of achieving food security. For example, when it comes to displacement and migration, this is obviously leads to instability and results from climate change and natural disasters. Next slide. And here, another project, Norwegian and Polish, on water available.
Now, this project is part of a European project where Spain, Greece, and the Italian National Research Centre is taking part. It's called Geostrategic, and it uses satellite images to identify this type of problem. The same has happened with another project, European project, which was similar for fields in general, the Bedouin camps and all types of settlements in the Negev desert. So the next slide, you see, on the whole, we've got to move from an analysis of what is happening or what will happen to the development of strategies, measurements in the field in cooperation with local researchers, supporting planning. And this has been established earlier by Mr. Bonfrisco. We've seen that there are satellites that are essential, but also the development of simplified models with the local researchers in order to estimate future conditions, but mainly the effect of various strategies for management and adaptation. Now, we've seen that this is essential, and we've seen this together with the Chima Foundation and with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. We are assessing the population of setting up a museum in Ethiopia to open up this knowledge to all those who wish for it. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Well, now we've entered an even more important area, the evaluations, assessments we can make together with other members of the EU. However, the central theme, scientific operation, technical operations, have to guide us. And in this context, the role of our military, or rather military cooperation, especially in that area, there was the Italian presence was there, the EU, within NATO, even beyond NATO, has taken on a very important role. And in many situations, the most important role, because the European Military Committee is more and more important when looking at hybrid threats and asymmetric tactics, which characterize the the various conflicts we're dealing with this century. I think the world has seen the role and the importance of the EU, and Africa is sending requests to confirm that the Union is capable of fulfilling this role, being a role. We're at a very specific moment in time in the history of the world, but we're very resilient, and we're also determined in setting up peace and development. It's within our genes, this fact that you have to act in order to invest in creating more long-term stability and prevent in this way the crisis. So as a component of the subcommittee for Security and Defence of the European Parliament, I have the pleasure of giving the floor to the Italian military representative at the committee, Admiral Dario Giacomelli, and I'd like to thank him for his presence. And I'd like to thank him for his work that he's always carried out within our military institution, which today is the best possible representative in this context. It's in a world that is changing. Thank you, Admiral. Thank you for your words. Thank you. Now, yes, I'm the Italian member within the Military Committee of the EU and NATO. So I'm also, I can see how these auditions function, and I also try to participate in as much as possible, representing always the Italian position in both sectors. Now, here we're talking of Africa, we're talking of the Sahel. You've designed very clearly the situation. I've taken a lot of notes on this, and this is really interesting. Africa is a very complex continent. It is very much in difficulty. It's a continent that is seeing a renewed interest on the part of foreign powers that are trying to project within, enter into a continent that already has problems, and they're trying to bring their own influence, cultural and political. This Furthermore, they are very invasive and often use irregular forces, creating further instability in these regions. So even though at times there is an effort, or our effort, international effort, to bring to this continent in as much as possible peace and stability, we find that our efforts are often disgregated, eroded right at their bases through destabilizing actions by these irregular groups who support or participate in really terrible violations of human rights. Now, all this has various consequences. You can see, and the statistics, I believe they're true, but 2019 it was the year when there was the highest degree of conflicts in Africa since the 40s, since 1946. So even in numbers, internal conflicts, these numbers are horrifying. Now, an important argument is that Africa is a very important continent for the EU. I feel that it is tied directly to the safety of the EU's, for the stability in Africa. Personally, this is my own assessment, but the future, the well-being of both continents are very strictly tied together on how these two continents will be able to work together and grow together. Africa and Europe would be good, and we have to work to make it a win-win. We can both gain a lot, and I'm not talking about money, which is also important, but welfare for the population, human rights, freedom of access to the global common, survival. It's not good to have these migrations because the people are not happy in those territories. This is a symptom, and this is something that has to be dealt with, and we're trying to do this right from its source. In 2011, the EU set up an integrated strategy for Sahel, which also looks at safety. It starts from a distance out of the EU for the your African continent and Sahel. So the missions, the EU missions which have developed in the African continent and the waters around Africa, I'm talking of Operation Atalanta in the Indian Ocean, activities that are undergoing in the Gulf of Guinea, activities in the Mozambique Canal. These are all activities that started then, and they're already active. But I'd say they're even before these new influences that have arrived in Africa. Initially it worked better, now they're a bit in difficulty, and when you're in difficulty in certain countries, it means that maybe it's time to reassess and reevaluate our way of working, our way of operating and cooperating with the African countries. The situation has changed, and in some way we need to correct our way of being, our way of operating. The missions we've carried out now, 3 of them, are all 3 in Africa, and I'm referring to the training mission in Somalia in 2010. And we had Mali in 2014, and in the African Republic, and greening in the Mediterranean, Atalanta on the other side. And we've got this at the national level. And I think that this becomes important for the EU when you start looking at the Gulf of Guinea, which is also very important. So I was saying it's necessary to change. We need a quantum leap as to the operations of the EU, because we need to do something. We need to make our missions work better together, North Africa and Sahel, integrating them with the maritime side. And because the sea goes towards the land and the land goes towards the sea, and things have to be a lot more integrated. We've got to try and work well together. We're doing that with the Atalanta operation in the Indian Ocean and the European Maritime Awareness Mission in the Strait of Hormuz, and we are bringing this to the same command chain so that they can work better together in a more coordinated way, because they're part of the same geopolitical and economic system. We really must ensure that this structure of command and control, the military side of the EU, has to function better. It's already working well, of course, and we see that as the Political Security Committee, that it is working at the diplomatic and political point of view, but there's external action, the European external action, on which the EU military staff depends, and the MPCC, which is a bit more military command with the external action services of the EU. And this could evolve towards an even more efficient structure. But there's also been something new from the point of view of the ideology, because in 2019 the military committee approved the concept of improving the efficacy of the military missions, and it says we have to be more flexible. African countries are all different, and so it is necessary to look at them in such a way so that whoever is focusing on those missions should be able to do more. And this is training, advising, guiding. And these, it is necessary to equip them, especially those who are combating terrorism. And so even the name has changed. They're no longer training missions. They're more generic military missions. I mean, this is symptomatic. You've got to give a greater flexibility. Then on 21st of March, the Strategic Compass for the EU was approved, which states that we have to be more decisive and we have to accompany and support better these forces, the forces for defence, by giving advice and instruments on institutional and structural levels, which gives greater indications on how you can address the instruments of security. And here too, we are thinking of the heads of defence. We started to look at Africa in a more targeted way. This is also extremely important. And we're thinking of setting up this operation in Niger as well. And this is going to be essential because Niger is a nation that is standing alone. It doesn't want any involvement, any interference from others. There is their own agenda, and they're asking us for what they need. This is a government that is asking us to carry out certain activities, and those activities, I think, will be guaranteed by the EU. And this is very important. We also have to consider that there are already missions within Niger which do function. There's a bilateral Italian mission which works very well and that the government really likes. Often we Italians are appreciated, and there's a Belgian mission too that is working very well. So one of the things we think for this new EU mission, it has to be very well, it has to be complementary to the transnational ones, and it will be something extra, but at the same time we need to push the EU. So they're national missions, yes, but the EU has to be present, at least from the diplomatic point of view, for the diplomacy. We'll have to say something on this. And this is very important. Now, before concluding, I wanted to give you a view of the situation in Mali. Now, the situation in Mali, the training part has been stopped because the local authorities decided they wanted to do something different. They wanted to listen advisors from Russia. And so we have the problem of ownership. If a country doesn't want us, there's nothing much we can do. So the mission was stopped because the risk was that if we remained as Westerners, as Europeans, it would have been with forces that maybe had fought in a different way from our principles and values. And this was unacceptable. However, we had 876 men in Mali, and so we reduced this to 279, which it was not totally closed because we're hoping that the Mali authorities will wake up and see, and at that point we'll already be there. We won't have to start all over again, and this is important. But for Niger, as we said, we'll probably start with another operation quite soon, and we are defining it within the EU. Again, Niger is a country that gives greater guarantees when it's a question of supporting our missions. Burkina Faso is a country that at the moment it's very difficult to think of a mission because it's a question of the will, the desire to accept forces that are going in towards the EU, which is a wonderful direction. And then the Gulf of Guinea, it's necessary to increase things to avoid any spillover of instability from Sahel towards the Gulf of Guinea. There are many interests there and a greater optimism on the part of the EU in the sector will be extremely useful with all the tools that the EU has. And then we'll see in future what the EU will decide. The interesting thing that I said earlier is to start thinking of these missions in the country which are well tailored and tailored towards the individual countries. The mechanisms are different, the governors are different. Some are aware and need the population. So if they see welfare, they can look at data. Some might be less interested, others more interested. And in that case, there isn't value or any point of principle that can be accepted. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Admiral. You see, I wasn't wrong when I said that today our military forces present and who are often participating in a significant fashion in these large operations in lands that are really suffering, it's thanks to they can transfer into a military instrument, a tool, a vision that is tied to principles and vision that they help us to defend. But today's discussion would not be complete if we would not consider the contribution given by the Atlantic Alliance, where we all share a vision of the view where human rights, sovereignty and international law are respected and where each country can choose its own route. And that's what NATO is. NATO in Africa is moving, supporting human rights, individual rights, democracy and the rule of law. So let's listen to Dr. Giovanni Romani, head of the Middle East, North African Sahel from NATO. There are various NATO partnerships and the quadrants we are discussing, and they're all included in the two greatest strategic reference sectors. The first one I would consider the future of Africa, the development of Africa, and the second is the open international order. Thank you. And thank you to all for your contribution, because everything that I've heard is extremely interesting, and to a certain extent, it's all complementary. So instead of following a script, I think I'd rather just speak off the cuff because there's so many things that you have said and ideas you've given me, and maybe I can add something to this. First of all, I'd like to start. I won't repeat what's already been said as to NATO's. I'd like to thank you. I'll give you some more specific data on what is going on in Africa. We're talking mainly of 5 countries we've got a partnership with. That's Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Mauritania. There are others in them, but they're in the Middle East and in the Gulf, and also a mission in Iraq. Now, the difference with the EU and with the UN, there isn't a permanent NATO presence in Africa. We don't have missions if we exclude Sea Guardian, which is a sea operation in the Mediterranean. We have a permanent presence in Iraq and also in Kuwait, but not in Africa. Now, this might give you the idea of a NATO that is not as committed in the African continent, but that's not true. We've got a policy which is general overview, even though many analysts see that NATO is more involved on the eastern front, which is true to a certain extent. But I'd say paradoxically, this southern aspect is a lot more relevant today rather than before Russia invaded Ukraine, because there is an enormous number of spillover facts, events.
You mentioned food security, energy security could be added too. In my work, this is something important in the Gulf, but also Algeria, but in many of these countries, agriculture too has been mechanized. And so the increase in energy prices has an impact too on these countries' ability to have agricultural policies that work. Then I wanted to stress too a point raised by some of you on security and development and how closely linked they are in Africa, and particularly in the Sahel. Then another point that's very important is demographic trends overall, and in the Sahel area as well as in Northern Africa. Then you've got climate change and its influence on security issues, and then the consequences on development of irregular immigration, of terrorism, because we've mentioned cross-border areas which have become a breeding ground for terrorism in Africa and Islamic extremism. So there's major concern in NATO. And if we look, well, you know, NATO works. It has summits, it has ministers meeting, and if you look at the statements from the summits, there's never been mention made of the Sahel until July 2021, when there was a paragraph on the Sahel saying the deteriorated situation in the Sahel was relevant for the collective security of NATO. And that was important because really it was a change in policy for NATO. And then that also was included as a part of the strategic concept. In June 2022, we had a support program for Mauritania, the only partner country in the Sahel. So in all of this, we have to say that, and it was said quite rightly, that Africa is a very complex continent. Every country has to be seen individually first. Then there are regional organizations, more or less successful. I talk to protagonists in Europe, in Africa, and the Africans tend to be critical about their regional organizations. They feel African solutions for Africa, Sahelian solutions for the Sahel. The solutions don't tend to come from internal organizations. Strategies for the Sahel are written from outside the Sahel. But why is that the case? And that's what I ask the African representatives. Why don't we have any solutions coming from internal organisations. In the EU, in NATO too, we've also had partnerships with different colleges, organisations, trying to develop solutions, but we have to reflect reality on the ground, because we're talking about a continent where in many countries there's still a certain tension about the colonial past. And this leads me on to international organisations, because often international organisations, EU and the NATO, for example, just tend to turn a blind eye to that. But there is this tension with our partners. So that's something that has to be taken into account. Now, I think the decision-making process in NATO unfortunately tends to mean that we go for the lowest common denominator rather than the highest common factor, because that's what we can get through because of the way our decisions are taken. So there are certain constraints. The Admiral mentioned an alliance of values. Quite right. NATO, EU, they're alliances of values. If we compare ourselves with some countries, not all countries have good governance, not all of them have anti-corruption standards that are up to snuff. And so I think we have to take reality into account. And we're in an area where there's a very high level of geostrategic competition, where Russia, China, and other countries too are infiltrating the area significantly. Your analysis, I don't fully agree with it, in the sense that I don't see the Russians behind the coup d'etat that took place. I see Russia as a power which takes advantages of, exploits opportunities, differently from China. China has a very long-term strategy and exploits economic opportunities in particular, has a plan, has a great deal of patience, and gradually manages to develop it. Russia, on the other hand, exploits opportunities. So a coup d'etat isn't necessarily caused by Russia, but if you have a coup d'etat, if a junta comes to power, then they'll provide it with protection and investments in particular. Mali, the European Union, other countries have all invested in the country, and then overnight everything that was done was destroyed. Lives were lost, the investments were overturned, and we have people wanting to flee to the west, and it falls into Russian hands, if you like. So you also have to look at the absorption capacity of countries. They're not necessarily in a situation to be able to manage all of the things that are offered to them, and they knock on different doors and get different responses. And there are individual agents, individual countries in the EU and NATO get involved without necessarily knowing what is being done by other organisations or countries. So we get duplication. So we do need coordination, better coordination. There are international mechanisms that exist for this that could help. In the Sahel, Coalition for the Sahel, for example. But it's important that events like this meeting, Madame Bonfrisco, or other structured mechanisms help us to avoid duplication and to ensure better coordination of what's being done. Final point I wanted to make from the NATO viewpoint is that we have limited presence and capacity to, and we think that it's important to always identify the value added. So whenever we get involved anywhere, and the same goes for Mauritania, for example, there's a very in-depth analysis of who does what to ensure that we can fill gaps that may exist rather than replicate what's being done by others. And a final point. The battle of the narrative, which is something that I come up against every day on a daily basis. And this is particularly obvious in Ukraine and in Africa too. One message that's very important is food security, but another one, actually two, that is important for local populations in Africa. Firstly, the Western world, they say, applies double standards. In other words, the way in which we've dealt with the crisis in Ukraine, where we threw our arms open to welcome those that were fleeing from the conflict, that's not how we've reacted to all the conflicts that were so well described in Middle East and North Africa. So double standards when it comes to Africa. And then the second point is this isn't our war in NATO and in the EU, because we are alliances of values, and Madame Bonfrisco talked about upholding the international order. Well, that's vital as far as we're concerned. The UN Charter needs to be respected by Russia and all the other countries in the world. So a world where that is not complied with, well, then the international order is no longer working. For African countries, on the other hand, what's important is to strike a balance in this geopolitical competition and maintain a balance. So if you look as well at how they vote on UNGA resolutions, their position may be different when it comes to the territorial integrity of Ukraine or on the invasion. Or they may be against that, but not in favour of sanctions. Areas which they see as falling not under the UN, but instead under UNESCO or the FAO. And that needs to be borne in mind when we are having discussions with those countries. They suffered through the Cold War, and they do see what's happening at the moment as a conflict between Russia and the West, and they're paying the price with a lack of food security and energy security. So that's a narrative that is very difficult to counter in Africa. Thank you very much, Dr. Romani. It really was a great pleasure listening to you. And for the final points you made as well. Because I think what you said does very much bring together the research that we had presented by the research team today, and links it to what's happening to the east of the European Union today, which has so many repercussions in Africa too, on all fronts in fact. And that too is reflected in the research. I said at the outset that I wanted to thank Ambassador Brunacci for having honoured us with his presence, as well as Dr. Pinelli. And obviously, Italian representation in the EU institutions is very important, because they too are responsible for passing on the messages that we develop. And we ask our representation to act to coordinate all of what we're doing, parliamentary diplomacy at our level, higher level diplomacy at their level. And it's very important that we, in fact, recognise all of the links that exist, but that they are well coordinated as we work with Africa. The Admiral made that point, Dr. Romani made that point, as we try and update not just the narrative that we're pushing, but also the perception Africa itself has of what we're doing. because perhaps actually maybe that's the most important point today. And so, Dr. Pinelli, I'd like to give you the floor. I'm sure you've got some very important points to make for us. Thank you very much, Madam Bonfrisco. Thank you very much to other speakers. It's like Christmas has come early today, because I'm allowed to speak of subjects that are very close to my heart with people that share that passion. So I'm the Africa advisor amongst the permanent representation for Italy to the EU. I've been in Brussels for 3.5 years now. Before that, I worked as deputy ambassador in Ghana for Italy, which means for 8.5 years now I've been working in and on Africa, and in particular the area of Africa we've been discussing this afternoon, Western Africa and the Sahel. I do apologise. I won't be concentrating on North Africa because that's no longer part of my remit. But I will be commenting on the links between the Sahel and North Africa, because there are so many of them. All you have to think is that the Sahel crisis started in North Africa. In 2012, we had the Arab Spring, and if you look at what happened in the following years, that's quite evident. So there are so many areas that could be developed. I'll start by focusing on why the Sahel is important for Italy and for the European Union, and then I'll move on to a brief analysis of the new European strategy for the Sahel, because the Admiral mentioned the 2012 strategic approach, but last year, 2021, in my working group, we actually updated that strategy and now have a new one for the Sahel. So the Sahel, and it really is a great pleasure to know that there are increasing numbers of Italian analysts interested in this area, because I think this was an area neglected by foreign policy experts in Italy in the past. We don't have an embassy in the 5 Sahel countries, unfortunately, or haven't, but that has changed over the last 10 years. And that means today, in the Sahel, we see that as a major priority for Italian foreign policy in Africa. When I arrived here, this process was still one that was underway, but it's now fully mature. And unless I'm corrected by my colleagues, I think the Sahel is seen as being equally important as the Horn of Africa, which is the area traditionally that we focused our efforts on in Africa. The Sahel, the Horn of Africa, in our vision, form an insecurity arc from Eritrea to Mauritania, and we've recently been considering how what's been happening in the Great Lakes region is contributing to what's happening in Sahel and the Horn of Africa too. The next Foreign Affairs Council next week will be discussing the Great Lakes. Rwanda, DRC, Burundi, Uganda will all be present. So, just so you know. So in Italy, started to get interested in the Sahel when it realized that what happened on our coasts was directly influenced by what was happening in the Sahel. So 2017, we opened an embassy in Niger, and then we opened other embassies, Burkina Faso, recently Mali, and we're going to be opening an embassy in Chad. We've stepped up development cooperation. We've tried, as well as Italians, to have an integrated approach towards stabilization, development, humanitarian assistance, to try to have a approach to deal with the roots of the crises affecting this vast area, because you can't see the Sahel in isolation. Africa, Sahel, the area is as large as Europe, and we have to take the territorial dimension into account. At political level, we've seen increasing numbers of visits by ministers and our presidents, 2017 for example. And we have also, well, we were amongst the founders of the Coalition for the Sahel, which was set up in 2020, and we've been actively involved. And in fact, we have staff seconded from our Foreign Office. We really have also increased development cooperation spending, which actually reversed the trend to cut that back, which we had seen in the past. So that is no longer the case.
So we're dealing more and more with this large region. Now, the reason why this region is so important for Italy is the same for being important for the EU. Of course, the EU has greater tools compared to Italy alone. Italy has a role within the EU of being a stimulus, trying to stimulate the EU to do more, to be committed more towards the stabilization of this region. Now, I reach the difficult point. It's true that today we're facing difficulties. We can't hide this. Actually, we should take the bull by the horns. The EU is facing difficulties in Sahel. And the very reasons that Bonfrisco has said, we have a policy that is based on principles and values, and we are dealing with governments who, military hunters who've taken power, breaking the constitutional order. Now, this causes a great problem for the EU to relate to these governments. Furthermore, as we've already seen, some of these governments, especially Mali, have turned towards Russia, who at the moment represents a strategic competitor of both of the EU, of Italy, and all NATO countries. Now, how can we react? Well, this is the problem. This is the point. We have reduced our presence. However, we believe it is essential to keep the dialogue open, an open channel, because we know that Russia is not capable of doing what the EU can do in Sahel. In other words, offering an integrated approach, a whole package of tools that Russia can't offer, can't make available. Now, the question, why is Russia entering Sahel? Is it an opportunist or is it a full strategy? I don't have an answer to this, but I have noticed with great concern this phenomenon. Especially, I see the fact that Russia is becoming stronger in countries that are strategic for the safety and security interests in Italy, especially when you look at the management of immigration, Burkina Faso, Mali, Libya. All that is left is Niger. The Admiral wants me to say the last thing on Niger. Yes, the reason why the Ambassador Pironacci is not with us, and we'd like to thank you for your invitation, and he apologize. It's because today they are discussing the launch of this new mission, training mission, this military mission for Niger. As we said earlier, the Admiral said in Niger we have many military bilateral military missions ongoing. Niger is very solid from an institutional point of view when compared with the other Sahel countries, but at the same time, President Bazoum, the new president, is a key figure we have to strengthen as much as possible, and we must protect. Unfortunately, in Niger too, there's a strong anti-Western narrative which is fed by this anti-colonial feeling, which comes from the past, but which is also fed by Russian propaganda, we suspect. Disinformation, fake news, the hybrid threat, which is represented by Russia. And we believe that there's an ongoing strategy there too. So we have to be very careful with Niger. It's essential that we go there because at the moment Niger is the most important partner for us in Sahel, but we have to go very carefully. We must strengthen certain synergies with the military missions that are already ongoing. There's also a German mission which should start, and it's already within the OTM and Mali. But it is essential to do what the Nigerians ask us to do. And Italy is working to bring this essential partner within the EU, and we will have an important role in this process in the future, this attempt to strengthen our role there. Thank you. Yes, I knew you would bring us some good news of your excellent work, and I'm really happy to ask Mr. Castaldo, who's just joined us, to conclude this interesting round of assessments. Each one has evaluated according to their role, and I like to stress how the role of Mr. Castaldo has always been committed on crucial aspects of foreign policy of the EU, and more particularly what is necessary for our country within the EU, recovering a role that often in the past we lost, but also because formally Mr. Castaldo is has one of the most important dossiers in the EU, the Horn of Africa. So he is the best person to share with us the points that he will guide in the position of the EU, part of the EP. Thank you, Mr. Castaldo, for being with us. Thank you. And I'd like to thank my colleague and friend Anna Bonfrisco for having extended this invitation and at this important moment, and especially given the importance of the panelists. And I apologize for not being here all day, but today we have an overlapping of many events. Another important group of visitors from Italy or local administrations are coming here to train on the European funds with the team who's been working with for many years. So I'm trying to share myself, to spread myself out. But I really wanted to be here with you in order to give you some comment following the discussion, because it's fairly obvious that in an unstable situation such as what we are seeing now, with many crises that are ongoing, I heard you mention the things that are dealing with touching the Sahel at the moment, as part of Mauritania reaches Sudan, and which is now going well beyond the borders of the states, and everything imposes more and more so as political decision makers, and given other factors for stability that are due to the war in Ukraine and the difficulty to find energy supplies and the trickle-down effect on our real economies, to have a wider thought on our relation with Africa. This is a continent that is tied, it's bound with the stability and the prosperity of the European continent. And that is why I wouldn't want us to make the mistake that is justified to a certain extent, but must not be excessive, of yet again not being attentive to our southern neighbour, our relations with the sub-Saharan colleagues, and shift our attention to this devastating crisis that we're dealing with, this criminal aggression of the Ukraine. And we must not look only at that axis, because the north-south axis is also essential and is changing more and more, and very difficult to foresee when we're looking at potential crisis. It's enough to consider, for instance, this increase, this demographic increase in our countries. One is Egypt. Imagine what it must be at this moment in Egypt to have a lack of basic foodstuffs in a country which has over 100 million inhabitants, has already lived through political instability in the last decades after the Arab Springs, and which could at any moment in time have greater internal conflicts and open up to the seduction of jihad, and seeing even more extremist groups, without forgetting the difficulties we're having already with the existing regime, which is extremely repressive and which violates human rights. So we've got all the elements. I've given you one example, but we really have a room for concern, and we must understand our position, especially as Italy, which is the wider Mediterranean. And that is why I wanted to look at this, because this instability is covering other countries too. It has an impact on others. And I would like to add Tunisia too, another key country for our relations with North Africa, where unfortunately socioeconomic instability is impacting also the political and institutional side, where we thought we had a solid ally tied to our values and principles. However, I'm going to discuss more the Horn of Africa, which is the crossroads for our continent. It's a great between the Mediterranean and the African continent and the Indian Ocean. But they're too one of the greatest trade routes of the world. More than a third of gas goes through the Horn of Africa, and which we will supply us. And this trend is increasing for reasons I don't need to explain. All you have to do is consider also the global value chains that are based on that corridor that goes through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea until it reaches the Suez Canal. So this has a potential, and it is a great strategic value. It's a region where we've got latent conflicts, but also others such as those in the Tigray. This crisis which persists, such as the difficulty for Somalia to guarantee the control of the whole sovereign territory when we're looking at the terrorist actions at Al-Shabaab, but also socioeconomic instability, which is very widely spread, where the effects of climate change are stronger than elsewhere. We're seeing the famine of the last few years has impacted these countries themselves. And if you consider the impact of this crisis of wheat and the speculation there, the figures would not justify that increase in prices, but you know very well how speculators take advantage of geopolitical situations for business. So these are all factors that paint a picture that could involve one of the greatest humanitarian crises. Now, if you think that opposite that, there's a country like Yemen, which now there's over 10 years of civil war, and if you think of that, you start realizing that the challenge is titanic, and we can't lose this challenge. Now, I've tried to express that the need to overcome our traditional approaches and have a more holistic approach. So we need a package of measures, of actions, so that we can combat this crisis, and we can look towards development in order to set up infrastructures that are essential to prevent this. We need know-how, we need best practices, we need to go and strengthen the food sovereignty, a greater independent production, so there's no longer this dependency with third parties. We've seen how any type of dependence is creates vulnerability, and we're also paying this directly. We need to work in order to set up solid governance and also overcome this mentality that is a bit obsolete between donors and beneficiary, which is still typical of our actions. And we make to make our counterparts more responsible and equal partners as African solutions to African problems. And we should do this. This should become part of our motto as well, and work strongly with the representatives, or at least with those who are willing and are committed, I would say, for this perspective, because one of the things the ambassadors of these countries have said to me, and I've dealt not only with the Horn of Africa itself, so Djibouti, Somalia, and Eritrea and Ethiopia, but also the borderline area, Sudan, Sub-Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya. And often they are consulted once the Apple plan is already established. Global Gateway, that's one for all. We involve them once we'd already given our view, and they can say, but why didn't you listen to us earlier? Why didn't you listen to our needs, our requirements, our perspectives? Why didn't you want to involve us, even just to ask for our opinion? We didn't necessarily want to influence you. It seems that, as usual, we're feeding this narrative again, which helps the disinformation campaigns from China and Russia to paint us as those who want to condition from the outside, as being colonial again. And I think that this change of paradigm is essential to remove these excuses, and so that we can act as well. These policies have to be dealt with because the competition is enormous. You will have seen that most of the regions of the Horn of Africa did not support the votes at the UN for the aggression from Russia, and also the fake referendum. And this shows that there's this movement because Russia is more present from a military point of view, and China dominates from an economic point of view, holding the infrastructures and controlling raw materials and commodities and the capacity to associate, bring to themselves the local elites and pushing them away from Europe and describing Europe as non-efficient and are denigrating Europe. So I think it's essential for us to make efforts in communication, but the best communication is the substance, which has to be sent then. The best factor, stability is an inclusive growth to strengthen this partnership. Now, obviously, there are other elements that are frightening us. This agreement between Sudan and Russia of a naval base there. Can you imagine if you had a Russian naval base there that could block the trade flows in the area? It would mean blocking energy supplies, blocking commodities for our raw materials for our industries. Just think of how much damage the incident in the accident in the Suez Canal. This is a threat, a gun to our heads. But here too, we've got to use diplomacy, wisdom, and involving as much as possible our partners. The question of food solidarity is a winning solution, and we can bring solutions to them and we can share them. And here too, and I reach the conclusion, not always talk about with the authorities. There are also local, provincial and regional authorities, and we have to involve them in order to say that the European paradigm is the one that improves the quality of life of people, and that's why it is more efficient. And then they will bring pressure to bear against the ruling classes. It's extremely difficult, but I don't see any other solution, because trying to beat China on its own territory with its own approach is lost right from the start. It's wrong. It's the wrong way. The other way is a bit more complicated, more difficult, but allows us to remember our fundamental Lodestar, that Africa will be the mirror of European geopolitics, and we want to see what kind of image we're trying to reflect. I'd like to thank you, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castaldo. You've confirmed what I said at the start. And I'm afraid the interpretation has stopped. The interpreters are required elsewhere. Thank you.
Parlamentare, quello dei governi, e che in questo suo ruolo di relatore sul Corno d'Africa mette a disposizione dell'intero Parlamento europeo un sistema di conoscenze e di competenze che sono così utili. Partendo dall'analisi svolta dai nostri ricercatori, noi arriviamo alla conclusione che ha appena citato Fabio Massimo Castaldo: dobbiamo aiutare molti stati africani a diversificare le rispettive economie o dare forma a nuove relazioni commerciali, non solo nazionali. Tra un paio d'anni la metà della popolazione africana avrà 25 anni. L'Africa è uno dei luoghi più giovani sulla Terra e quindi fa parte del futuro della Terra. E non dimentichiamo che l'Africa subsahariana è una grande forza geopolitica che, per le ragioni che ha appena illustrato Fabio Massimo Castaldo, ha plasmato il nostro passato e modellerà il nostro futuro. Io voglio ancora ringraziare i nostri autorevolissimi ospiti e chi ci ha seguito online, così come ringraziare il gruppo ID, il suo policy advisor Cialfi, lo staff guidato da Andrea Marinoni, Carlo Nan, Giovanna Piovani, Tommaso Filippini, che hanno reso possibile la realizzazione di questo evento così importante, che vorrei avesse una cifra politica, utilizzando le parole di una frase di una grande politica del mondo, la statunitense Madeleine Albright, che disse qualche anno fa: contrariamente al comune sentire, lo slancio non è dalla parte dei nemici della democrazia. In molti casi gli autoritarismi dei nostri giorni non riescono affatto a garantire benessere ai loro cittadini. Pertanto la democrazia non è una causa che si sta estinguendo, in realtà è pronta per un grande ritorno. Dedico quindi, nel ringraziare ancora voi tutti, il nostro lavoro di oggi alla memoria dell'ambasciatore Attanasio e al carabiniere Iacovacci, che hanno perso la loro vita servendo l'Italia per aiutare l'Africa. Grazie e buona serata a tutti.
E grazie a te per questa bellissima idea, per il meraviglioso lavoro e l'ottima cooperazione che abbiamo da sempre in commissione, e grazie per aver ricordato l'ambasciatore Attanasio, che peraltro io ho avuto l'onore di conoscere in missione nel 2015 in Nigeria, quando era primo consigliere dell'ambasciatore sì, dell'ambasciatore appunto l'ambasciatore Rustico,